Within the last hour, by a majority decision of 4-1, the Alberta Court of Appeal ruled in favor of Alberta's challenge of the federal carbon tax, striking down the federal carbon tax. This is a great victory for Alberta and a victory for Canadian federalism. And we will take this decision with us as we stand up for our allies in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Quebec at the Supreme Court of Canada next month.
Two courts have upheld the federal position with respect to the constitutionality of this. This was a step in the process today. We look forward to the Supreme Court opining on the issue of jurisdiction. I do find it odd that Conservative politicians who profess to be believers in the market are opposed to a market mechanism and somehow are more interested in regulating reductions in greenhouse gas emissions.
Welcome back. We're here with the Power Panel, Kathleen, Brad, Yolande, and Tim. Kathleen, I'm going to circle back and start with you again because Premier Kenney was glowing in that.
Oh yeah.
that was a victory lap if I've ever seen one. If you could talk a bit about how this decision is being perceived in Alberta.
Oh well, you know what? He walked into a standing ovation. So I was staring at an empty podium for the longest time, and then he finally walks in. I'm going, great, we finally get started. I can't even see him because everyone's losing their minds. They were so happy, and of course he was happy as well, and everyone sat down, and I believe the clip you showed had yet another standing ovation. There were a few of those, by the way. He was happy to start with some good news and talk about that rather than tech, and I think he was rather fond of some of the language in the ruling as well, a constitutional Trojan horse. It's sort of hard to resist that in the battle going forward. I know the federal environment minister is basically saying, well, we're winning so far. You have one ruling, we have two. I mean, that's sort of
true.
what it sounded like.
That's what
honestly.
It boils down to. You're right. Yeah.
Did it not sound like a playground? Because it did to me. And I guess the Supreme Court will have the final say. But, you know, 4-1 is pretty substantial. And some of the language in that ruling, I'm sure you've had a chance to look at some of it, but many of the viewers will not. I mean, the federal legislation is a, quote, constitutional Trojan horse with, quote, buried, wide-ranging discretionary powers, attempting to use a valid and international concern about climate change to vary division of powers in Canada, and the pressing international problem of carbon emissions does not justify abrogating the existing division of powers in the country. I mean, it's a pretty substantial ruling.
It is substantive. Tim, what do you think the implications are for the federal government? You heard Kathleen sort of very accurately characterize how they responded to this, but she's right. I mean, the wording is very interesting in this. It's very much like a constitutional argument. It's a jurisdictional argument, like don't wade into the province's territory.
Well, and it reminds me a lot of what happened here in the 80s and 90s when Newfoundland Labrador was fighting with Pierre Trudeau for a while on who controlled the offshore oil resources. It's a very similar fight, minus the carbon tax, but it's about who controls it, who makes the money off of it, and who has the final say. I suspect Jason Kenney is going to borrow a little bit of the Premier of the Day's book here, Brian Peckford, and trumpet this as a big victory. And I agree, it's a big public relations victory for him today. The key is, Vashi, how does he use it to negotiate? The federal court, the Supreme Court's going to say what it's going to say later in March or after the hearings are done in mid-March. You use these things as negotiating tools. And right now the relationship, as we've discussed, is very frayed. So what does Jason Kenney use this for and to what end? That's what I'll be watching for.
Brad, what's the answer to those questions?
Well, it's coming right up here. Sorry,
Thank you. Great. Yeah. Can't wait. Yeah.
It's fascinating for folks at home who are watching. Sunday night, tech withdraws its application. Canada's broken. Monday afternoon, Alberta court rules that the Trudeau's tax is unconstitutional. Federalism is working. It's like 24 hours. The country was broken and then it was saved again. 24. So stay tuned to the Tuesday Power
What will
Panel
happen tomorrow?
When Canada hopefully won't be broken and go back to it. I think Tim is right. I think that this will, the Supreme Court's going to rule on this, so this is not done yet. And I think politicians should be a little careful when they get, a goal in the first period. There's still 2 more periods to play here. The hockey game is not over for Jason Kenney. That may come back to haunt him if the Supreme Court rules in favor of Ottawa and peace, order, and good government, which is the federal government's argument as to why their taxes is there. In terms of, what does Alberta now have negotiating positioning? Perhaps it does, and perhaps it rests with the definition of what a made in the province solution can be. Obviously, what Jason Kenney's original carbon pricing scheme did not meet the threshold. Is there room to redefine that, or is there something else that Jason Kenney can do to get over that line as an example as to what will do that? But this argument of whether or not Ottawa has the right to impose carbon pricing on Canadians is far from settled, and it's far too early to do the dance.
Which is interesting because even when you talk about, Yolande, the possibility of negotiation, listening to the federal environment minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, he really doesn't sound like, maybe we should sit back down and talk about this. In fact, that was most of my line of questioning to him. I was saying, forget about the discussion on the carbon tax. We know it's efficient. We know it, there's many studies out there. I don't want to debate the science right now, but the way in which it was applied, which most provinces argue was very heavy-handed, so much so that Quebec, which has cap and trade, has even joined on to Saskatchewan's appeal because of that.
Well, my understanding is the reason why is Quebec has intervened. It's a matter of principle, like in general, whenever there's a question of autonomy, they will always defend Quebec's jurisdiction to legislate or regulate the issue, regardless of what's happening.
But that's the same argument that Alberta put forward in this case, right?
And that's why, and they won on that basis, not on the principle of a carbon tax or not. My point being that going forward, if we're talking about negotiations, and Quebec is a good example of that, one of the reasons why things went forward is because there was already the cap and trade issue. I think Jason Kenney would be wise, as opposed to just seeing the negative with respect to the federal government, as to negotiate the terms of and be more aggressive in his willingness to address climate change, as his predecessor was.
Who, by the way, is standing by. We're going to interview former Premier and current Leader of the Opposition, Rachel Notley, in just a few moments. Tim, let me get you back on this, and just the idea of not only, again, though, I go back to what we were saying in the previous panel, because not only was Minister Wilkinson not signaling a desire to sit back down with the province, but neither was Jason Nixon, the provincial minister of the environment. He was literally on this program saying that the federal government is attacking hockey dads and moms.
Yeah, but again, we've seen this play before again here and elsewhere. This goes back and forth and back and forth. Part of what Jason Kenney is going to try and play for is a new federal government, as he did in the last election campaign. And if he can't get that, he's going to try and see if he can find public opinion support elsewhere, as he's already tried to do by rallying the other premiers. The really interesting thing, though, and I think it goes back to our first conversation, we were talking about acrimony. And acrimony, as Kathleen knows, as you know, as Yolande and Brad also knows, always been part and parcel of resource politics. But what's really different now, and this may be the challenge here for Premier Kenney, as it was with Frontier, is the complexity of things. It's not just about jurisdiction, and it's not just about money anymore. Does Jason Kenney and the Alberta government have the playbook to deal with all the other complex elements that are layered within here?
Kathleen, I'll give you the last word. What are you watching for the next few days on this?
Well, look, I'm still, the Fair Deal panel is still sort of lurking out there, let's not forget. And he did go on, Vashti, at length about the assertion of Alberta's autonomy. And he can hardly wait for the Fair Deal panel, which reports at the end of March. And, and I think finding public support for a lot of the measures in there, I think he anticipates all of this between tech and a victory on the carbon tax, even if it's not a long-standing victory. And I guess we'll find out. But we may not find out by the time they decide to sort of move on some of these measures. And I think we've only just begun, is what I'm trying to tell you. As big a day as today was, there are a lot of big days to come.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to our power panel this evening. Great discussion. Thanks to Kathleen Petty, Brad Levine, Yolande James, Tim Powers, and Brandy Morin, who joined us for a couple segments earlier. Hi, I'm Vashti Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.